Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 297. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about palaces and temples and geisha as we go to Kyoto, Japan.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have three news stories for you. The first one is there's a Russian company that's selling sleep boxes. These are small, self-contained cabins that they can put in out-of-the-way places, in airports, or even you can make a hostel by combining a number of these. So if you get caught in a long layover sometime, look around and maybe you'll find a sleep box. Or if you're looking for a more upscale place to sleep, Conan O'Brien has put his TV studio on Airbnb for $1 a night. He's serious about this. He's looking for a family to come stay. They're going to be filmed, so only do this if you want to be on TV. But if you want to be on Conan O'Brien, for $1 a night, you can stay at his TV studio. And then if you didn't want your family to travel on 9/11 because you were worried that something might happen, what would you do about it? If you said phone in a bomb threat, that's the wrong answer, as a woman found out who has since been arrested. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Phil Smy, who's come to talk to us about Kyoto, Japan. Phil is a Canadian currently living in Spain talking about Japan. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
And why are we talking about Japan?
Well, I mean, why wouldn't we be talking about Japan? Japan is a country I never wanted to visit. I would probably almost zero desire to go to Japan. And a few years ago, my wife, who had been to Japan before we had met, said, oh, come on, let's go to Japan and everything like that. And so I said, fine. I'm always up for traveling, go someplace new. So I would say in between getting off the plane in Tokyo and getting on the bus from the airport to go into town, I was in love with the country. And I said, I'm coming back here. And that was in the first 45 minutes. Now, part of that could be that I come from what I like to call the anti-Japan, which is Spain. And everything that is organized and meticulous and perfect about Japan is the opposite about Spain. I apologize to any Spaniards who are listening, but I live in Andalusia, so I'm sure anybody will cut me some slack. So.
Well, and obviously you don't live there because you hate it either, but...
No, I don't hate it, no. But it's a nice contrast. Let's put it that way. So, I love Japan. So that's why we're here talking about it.
So, Kyoto, which is what we're going to focus in on. Why should someone go to Kyoto?
Well, if someone is interested in Japan, I probably don't have to tell them that, because Kyoto, I was surprised to find, is the number one tourist destination outside of Tokyo in Japan. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason for that is that it survived unspoiled, pretty much, from the Second World War. So it's got all of its history, and of course it has an awful lot of history to present. It's the former capital of ancient Japan. It's got more temples than you could shake a stick at, of various varieties, and it's just, steeped in that history. And it's not what people think about when they think about Japan. I think they think about Electric Town and Tokyo and the Shibuya crossing and thousands of people and all of that. And Kyoto's not like that at all. It's a bit of a low-rise city, it's not all skyscrapers, and it is history. And I think you get a real sense of Japan's psyche by going to Kyoto. You're not wowed by the technology, I think.
Okay. And what would you recommend for an itinerary of someone going to that area?
Well, I mean, the thing, of course, I think that people go for, and I'm not going to dissuade anybody from that, is the temples. Mm-hmm. And there's probably 1,000 Buddhist temples in Kyoto City, in the prefecture. More than that, probably double, close to 2,000. And there's also, 400 Shinto shrines in the city. So really, you kind of go to Kyoto to get templed out, I always call it. And like I say, you could see a couple of temples or shrines a day and still be there for years. And so the itinerary, I would say, is to spend your time looking at the significant monuments of Kyoto and, throw in a few new things too, because you are in Japan, so you want to experience some of the Japaneseness of it. So, I would kind of break it down like that.
Now, I have a son who is going to be traveling with me this year, but stopped traveling with me for a number of years because I think I dragged him to every cathedral in every city we went to in Europe. I suspect that even I probably wouldn't have the stamina to go to 1,000 temples, so there are a couple that you would pick as the must-see.
I mean, it's not just temples, but we'll start with the temples, because I think that's kind of the big thing. You have, of course, the very famous Golden Pavilion, which is Ginkakuji, which is in the northwest of Kyoto. And I mean, that's the thing we see often on posters from the Tourist Board of Japan, with this beautiful building that's completely covered in gold, leaves kind of in the middle of a pond. And I think you have to go and see that. And there's a kind of a companion to that, which is the Silver Pavilion, which is kind of disappointingly actually not coated in silver. It's just wood. I don't think they ever got around to the silver part. So you've got the gold and the silver pavilions. And you've got Nenzenji, which is kind of the first Zen Buddhist temple of any note, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a massive complex. And, with those three, you're going to get a real sense of those big ticket temples and see the history, see the screens, see the artwork, and you get to go into all of these, and they also have spectacular grounds and spectacular gardens, and that's a good couple of days, I would say, to go and see those three, and perhaps also throwing in Toji Temple, which is the famous 5-story pagoda temple in Kyoto. So those are kind of the big temples. I mean, anybody can go on to Wikipedia or things like this and get the list of the 1,000 if they really want. But if you don't go and see those 4, gold and silver, Nenzenji, and Toji, I think you're really going to miss out.
Okay. And you mentioned that this was the ancient capital of Japan. What's left from that time?
Lots. You're asking the tough questions today. I know you're a bit of a history guy, so I don't want to get this wrong. But these temples are easily 800 years old, if not longer. I mean, some of them are 1,200 years old. There's a lot of temples around from that time. Japanese seem to be somewhat careless and always burning things down and rebuilding them. But, that happens, and that's a natural thing. And so you'll have these grounds where one building will be 1,200 years old, one will be 700 years old, things like this, like Toji Temple. Those buildings are, hundreds of years old. So everything is left from that time. And of course you have the Imperial Palace there that's still there from that time. And the Imperial family still go and use that palace to this day. So you do have a lot of that still intact.
And you say from that time, as I'm seeing, Kyoto became the capital sometime just before 800 AD.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we do have a fair amount of history there, okay?
Yeah. And I mean, Kyoto actually means capital city.
I did not know that, okay.
Yeah, so, we had a couple of capitals actually in that area. Because you have Kyoto, and you also have Nara, that was a capital, I think before, though I may have my dates mixed up, that Nara, which is about 30 minutes south of Kyoto, was also a capital of Japan at one point. And that's amazing. I mean, that's a whole other biggest Buddha in Japan and things like that. You can go to Nara, but we're going to stick with Kyoto because it's my place,
Okay. No, I think you're probably right on that. I don't know for sure on the dates there, but I see that Kyoto is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, or that 17 of the historic sites there are part of the Historic Monuments of Ancient Kyoto. And what I'm reading on that site is that it was the capital for 1,000 years.
Yeah. Yes. Until the Edo period kicked in, Kyoto was the capital. And so that's why it's not really that long ago that it kind of moved. And so that's why it's great that it was so preserved, because you do have a wide swath of history about Japan in that one town. And you have the other sides of Kyoto as well, aside from that kind of history. I mean, the other thing I think people think about when they think about Kyoto, they think about the geisha, because geisha come from Kyoto.
Okay.
So you have that region of Kyoto as well, which is called Gion, which, you can walk down the street and see geisha walking around. And lots of traditional arts go on there, and some very high-end dining and things like that. Definitely Gion is another place I would recommend. Kind of at dusk into the early evening is a great time to go. You really see the geisha and the maiko, which are geisha in training, going from restaurant to restaurant doing their entertaining.
Interesting. Okay, so we got 4 temples, we've got the castle. Is there anything specific we should make sure that we see at the castle? Are we doing a tour when we go there, or what?
Actually, you bring up an interesting point, because there is the actual Kyoto castle as well. There's the Imperial Palace, and then there's the castle.
Okay, I didn't realize those were separate. Okay.
They are separate. I'm not a big fan of the castle. It's a very wide gravel parking lot with a building. And, there's a lot more history, I think, in other areas than going to the castle. But to go to the Imperial Palace, you definitely have to take a tour. I don't even actually know if you can go in without taking a tour, but It's a spectacular grounds, and they go through all the details of the buildings. You have things, everything from the chrysanthemum patterns on the end of roof beams to, who lives there and when the royal family is there and all of that. I like taking those kinds of tours. I think you can read the brochure, but it's nice to hear it coming out of the mouth of somebody who is steeped in that culture.
Okay. When we want to take a break from the history, you mentioned the neighborhood where we can see the geishas and the geishas in training.
Gion. Yes,
Gion. What else should you do?
There's another thing which is really great, which is the Philosopher's Walk, which is a long path along a small and kind of tributary stream that is just covered with cherry blossom trees. And if you go during cherry blossom viewing time, which is when I would kind of recommend going, is that... And
that's May-ish?
That's in April.
April, okay.
Yeah, and it fluctuates. I mean... They actually, if you watch on the internet or on television, they have the Sakura Watch, and Sakura means cherry blossom. But they actually have like a daily update of where things are blossoming and where they're not in the whole country. The Japanese are kind of obsessed with cherry blossoms, I think. So they have this Philosopher's Walk, and you can walk along that, which is quite beautiful, and there's lots of little restaurants along. And it's kind of become a bit trendy, and I have a picture of one place that sells Hopi Indian art there and things like this. So, it's got all kinds of stuff, And,
the traditional Japanese Hopi Indian
traditional
art.
Japanese arts of Hopi Indian art and kimonos, So it's a funky place, and, they're starting to develop a coffee culture there. So you've got little cafes, which is new. They didn't have that 20 years ago, from what I understand, even. Coffee culture is new. So they've got that, the Philosopher's Walk. And, kind of to get even maybe more modern, they have some beautiful covered shopping streets, one of them called Nishiki Nishiki Market, which, you can walk down this little narrow alley and it's got stalls on either side selling food and sake tasting and all kinds of stuff like that. And that's, again, right in the center of town. And they have actually quite a wide complex of covered streets to do shopping for modern things as well as, traditional things.
Okay. You mentioned the cherry blossoms in April is a good time to go there. Are there any specific other, maybe even day of the year that's a great day to be in Kyoto?
Yes, so like I say, April time, we always go in April.
Okay.
Like every April since that first fateful trip we've been in Japan. So April's good. It gets incredibly hot there in the summer, but if you can stand it, I recommend the dates of July 15th, 16th, 17th, which is every year is a festival called Gion Matsuri. And the Gion Matsuri, ironically, is not in Gion, but is where they have these massive, massive floats, for want of a better word, that are in and of themselves hundreds of years old, that they cart through the streets chanting and things like this. And each neighborhood of Kyoto has their own float. And that is a spectacular festival. I was there this year. That was the first time I'd seen it. And, I felt like I was going to combust when I was standing there watching this. And these guys are dragging like a 8-story tall float through the streets, uncovered, out in the middle of the sun. And it is a spectacular festival. And the night before that the floats are dragged through the streets, they have a huge open air. Basically, the entire central part of Kyoto is turned into an open air market where there's food. And I was told by my friend that more than 1 million Japanese visitors come for that one night. And it was just packed. But it was an incredible experience. And in Japan, people famously talk about how safe it is. You don't have to worry about, you don't even think about the safety aspect of it. You just go and, walk around with 1 million Japanese people.
You talked about your first 45 minutes in Japan, not in Kyoto, but in Japan in general, that you fell in love with Japan. It came as a bit surprise to you, I'm guessing. So what was it about the first 45 minutes in Japan that triggered what's obviously become a love for the country?
The people are so nice. And I think that's when people talk about Japan, they don't talk about the people very often. And I think that's because I think Japanese are very reserved and you don't really get to know them. But they are so service-oriented. And I think that was the big kicker for me coming from Spain, is that in Japan, they're so service-oriented that they have a person who puts your luggage onto the bus and gives you a little ticket, and then they have another person who puts you onto the bus. And, they have an abundance of people doing a job where, in most other countries, they wouldn't even have one. And so, they have luggage delivery services, for instance. Like when we get off the plane now, we don't even take our bags with us. We just pick up the bags from the carousel, and we go out through customs and we give them to a luggage delivery service that for $15 will take your bags, from Tokyo to Kyoto if you want, which is 600 kilometers, and they'll do that for $15 a bag, and they'll have your bags at your hotel or your house the next day. So this kind of service, and how everything is meticulous, and there's such a great pride in doing jobs that we think are crappy jobs. But they're defined by their job. So, you can tell that they want to do their job as well as possible, even if their job is opening the door to people coming through customs. They want to do that as well as possible. And that really struck me. Really struck me.
Interesting. What's the best day you've had in Kyoto?
Well, I think the Gion Matsuri, the night of Gion Matsuri, was a great night. I think the days get better for me now because I'm speaking more of the language, so you kind of break through that barrier a little bit. But
how big a barrier was it?
That is a barrier that should not be underestimated. In the big cities like Tokyo and Kyoto, I'm sorry I'm diverging from your question for a second. In the big cities, you have some people who speak English. In Tokyo, you have a lot. But even though I would say, from my understanding, that almost everybody under the age of 35 probably could speak to you in some kind of broken English, they will not. So you have to have a guidebook, that's for sure. So people who like to go off-piste and do their own thing, once you're out of the big cities, you really are on your own because you're going to have to figure it all out. So there is a language barrier, but they're good with sign language. They don't expect you to speak Japanese, to be honest. They're shocked when you speak a word of Japanese because they don't think that foreigners can learn it. So if you learn a little bit, that'll get you a long way. And they're very accommodating, and they'll do whatever they can to help you, but there is going to be a barrier with the language. You're going to have, your concierge is going to speak English and stuff like that. But in general, I see it becoming more prevalent, but out of the cities, it's still a long way to go.
And you mentioned you have to have a guidebook, and one you would recommend?
There's a few books that are specific about Kyoto, which are nice. And there's one called Old Kyoto, which is written by a woman who lives there, and she's got some interesting kind of off-the-beaten-path destinations. I think the rough guides are pretty good. There's one called 29 Walks in Kyoto or something like that, which is different paths you can take to see the big sights and things like that. And it's not a driving city. You're not going to drive when you're there. You're going to take public transit and you're going to walk. So that's a really interesting book for that. But any of the big guidebooks, I think, they do a pretty good job of giving you the introduction because it's not something that you're going to be the first person to discover,
Okay. And you mentioned, safe, we don't have to worry about that. But are there any other warnings that you would give in terms of before you go there, you really should know?
Don't be fooled by the cost of things. There's quite a dichotomy there, and that people think Japan's really expensive. And if you want to spend a lot of money, you can do it in Japan. That's not a problem. But a lot of things are actually quite cheap, and you can eat quite cheaply. You can eat lunch for $5 and dinner for $15 and these kinds of things. That's not a problem to do that. But the one thing that is expensive, and you have to factor it in, is transportation. And I'm one of these guys who plans everything. So when I go, before we go, I'll have everything planned. But you have to understand that transportation is expensive. Even transportation in the city can be quite expensive. Like a subway ticket's going to be like $3 and things like this. So you just have to be prepared for that.
Now, when you say you plan everything, I have a new standard for what that means based on a traveling companion I just had going with us to Mexico. She said she had a coworker who planned a 6-month sabbatical, and he knew not only what his airplane tickets were, okay, we usually do that, and what all his hotels would be, okay, we often do that. We didn't do that on this trip, but we often know that. But he also knew what restaurants were in town and had actually gotten the menus for all the restaurants and had circled what he was going to have for lunch or dinner for every meal for 6 months. So that's my new standard for someone who is a planner at a level at which I never even aspire to be. So you're thinking more, you plan out what you're going to do the various days, or?
No, I don't even. Okay, maybe I now feel that I don't plan at all. I will take it all back. But what I'll do, I'll know what I want to go and see.
Got it.
I don't know maybe when I'm going to go and see it because, hey, what happens? The weather
Sure.
might change.
Right.
And you have to take into account that the interesting thing is a lot of stuff's not on the internet. So you're not even going to be able to find out a lot of restaurants and things like that. And if it is on the internet, it's certainly not going to be in English. So you have to go with the flow in Japan. And Japan, of course, it's a food culture. So as long as you're willing to eat things that you don't know what they are, everything is going to be tasty. It's a great place to eat.
Now, you've mentioned, and I've certainly heard this before, that it's a more difficult country to get to know people, at least at any depth. Are there any memorable locals that you've started to get to know that you wish you could introduce people to?
Yeah, I guess I should preface this by saying that I actually have a house in Kyoto. So now I'm not staying in a hotel, I'm staying in my own house. So I'm getting to know the neighbors. And one thing that's neat about Japan, and I think maybe a lot of other places are like this, but Japan is very much like this, that it's a collection of very small neighborhoods. And every small neighborhood is self-contained. So in our little neighborhood, we've got a couple of bars, a couple of supermarkets, a couple of this. You don't have to leave the neighborhood. So I think you get to really know people. And I always liked to travel like that. When I would go someplace, any place, I always liked to stay in the neighborhood. And I have this affinity for the working class people. And God, that sounds pretentious to say that. I'm sorry. But anyway, so the people who work in the shops and things like that, those are the people I'd like to get to know because they're going to know what's going on. And I think I've met a couple of friends there who are great. And I think that you can broach conversation with anybody. Like if you go to one of the numerous coffee shops and try and speak to somebody there, if they can get over the language barrier and you can muddle your way through, I think you're going to find somebody who will go that extra mile for you, and they're very accommodating and very helpful. And I don't need to single out a single person, I don't think, or an individual at this point, because I think anybody who you can find through a casual relationship, I think it's going to be an amazing experience, something that you will take home.
Okay. I'd like you to think of a time where you were really confronted with, oh, this is Japan, things work different here.
I don't think there's ever a second that you're in Japan when you don't think, oh, this is Japan, things work different here. Somebody once asked me what I loved about, why did I buy a house in Japan, which is recent, by the way. Why did I buy a house in Japan, and why would I, do that? And I said, well, why wouldn't you? And they proceeded to list the reasons why they wouldn't do that. And one of them was, well, you'll never be nothing but an outsider. And I said, well, that's, funnily enough, the reason I bought a house there. I like being an outsider. And in Japan, you have no hope of ever being anything other than an outsider. And so, I think every second of the day, you recognize that you're in Japan. I don't think you're ever, if you're going to ask me that question, that, like, what made you feel most like home or something like that, or, I'm paraphrasing you. I don't think there'll be much of a chance of me answering that. I don't think there is any time in Japan where you think that you're not in Japan.
So what are some examples of things that work differently, just in everyday life?
Here's a simple one, bread. Like if you go to a supermarket and try and buy some bread, and they sell bread in, this is going to sound insane, in packs of 5 slices.
Okay.
So you pay, let's say, $1.25 for 5 slices of bread, which, first of all, is outrageous because they don't, bread's an exotic thing for them, so it's expensive. But their slices of bread are not like our little slices of bread. Each slice of bread is probably an inch thick.
Okay.
That's the way they like their bread. So, that's, when you go and walk around, I didn't actually recognize it as bread when I was first looking. It's like, wow, that's weird. I thought I'd seen lots of kind of bread in my time, but I'd not seen an inch thick slice of bread sold in 5 packs. So, yeah.
What's your best money-saving tip for Kyoto?
My best money-saving tip, I think, I have one that's for Japan in general, and that is that, they have the famous Shinkansen, which is the bullet train.
Right.
And it is expensive, but you can actually buy tickets the day before that are 30% off, and I don't think a lot of people know that. Up to the day before, I should say. So it's actually, if you're going down to Kyoto and let's say you've flown into Tokyo, it's worth it for you to actually stay in a hotel. If there's 2 of you, for instance, stay in a hotel and delay your trip for a day so that you can get the cheap Shinkansen tickets. And I'll send you a link to somebody who's written a brilliant article about what you have to ask for, because you have to ask for something specific. But it's a brilliant bargain. It really reduces the price of the ticket if you're not on something like the Japan Rail Pass.
Okay. You mentioned food, and that you might not know what you're eating, but it would be good. What should we try? And how are we going to know that that's what we're having?
Yeah. Well, I think everywhere that I've ever traveled, if you say to somebody behind the counter, I'll eat anything, I think there's a flash. I think it's this human nature where they say, oh, really? And,
I don't know that I would ever say that.
Yeah. Because I do. I say, I'll eat anything. What do you want? I did that in West Africa once, and that was a bad experience. But so we did that in a sushi bar one night, and the guy handed over, it was a very nice upscale sushi bar in Gion, and they handed over a little bowl of something. And I ate it, and it was, the texture was a bit odd and things like that. And I asked him what it was, and my wife also proceeded to eat it. And I asked him what it was, and thankfully, she thought he said it was eggs and octopus. That was fine, but after a couple days, I had to break to her there was actually an octopus's egg. And which is like the size of an egg, but it's filled with hundreds of little eggs.
Okay.
And it pretty much tastes as you would expect. It was like a gritty, fishy thing. So yeah, I would say don't go in and say you'll eat anything, but they have such amazing noodle soups. I love ramen noodle soups, and we think of them as like instant cup noodles, but my God, the stuff you can get. They have these places you can go in. This is a good money saving tip, actually. Go in, you can buy a ticket at the door. They have like a big vending machine. And you choose your soup from pictures. Everybody knows the famous food pictures of Japan. You choose your picture, hit the thing, put in. Sometimes they're like $4.50, $5, something like that. And you get your ticket and you go in, you go up to the counter. So it's nicely alleviated your need to communicate what you want, because you can just pick it, and hand your ticket over and you'll get what you want. And you'll get some amazing soups and things like that. And I would just say, I often look around and just point at something and say, I'll have whatever that guy's having. He's still alive. Surely I'll be okay.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Kyoto.
When you go to Gion, this, memoirs of a geisha moment, you walk down the street and you see these girls dressed up like this and everything like this. Something changes when you look and you notice that they're actually all using Facebook on their iPhones. Or they're these kinds of things. In between restaurants, they're tweeting. That really kind of... I have a good picture, actually, of a couple of geishas riding a bike. And it's just, you don't expect to see it. And this juxtaposition of history and the present is, I think, that's the great Japanese moment for me, is when that happens. When you realize that these are people who actually managed to drag their customs along with them as they create, one of the most modern societies in the world. They also have this society that's constantly in touch with its history. I love those kinds of moments, and you'll see that all the time.
Okay. As we go to wind this down, before I get to my traditional last two questions, anything else that you think people should know before they go to Kyoto?
Be prepared to do a lot of walking. Be prepared for changeable weather. The weather does change at the drop of a hat, and they're really good at having umbrellas for sale everywhere, like umbrellas for $1. So you don't really have to take one with you as long as you're going to be in a populated area. And Kyoto's surrounded by mountains, and there's a lot of these temples are up in the mountains as well, some of the most spectacular ones. And even in like April, it can be pretty cold up there. So dress sensibly. That would be my things for people going. There's a million other things we could talk about, but I think that that's a pretty good sampling.
Okay. And you've heard the show before, so you know the last two questions. You really know you're in Kyoto when what?
A really personal answer is you really know you're in Kyoto when you would be happy just to spend your entire vacation in the train station. Because the train station is one of the most spectacular, all-encompassing buildings in town.
So you're not just train watching, you're shopping and eating and...
You could dedicate a whole show to this train station. I mean, they have the most spectacular... It's about 11 or 12 stories tall, and they have an open staircase down the middle, 11 stories tall, which is kind of terrifying, but... I have some great pictures that go all the way down these stairs. It's a spectacular building. And I think the first time we went to Kyoto, we were just on this flying trip, and I thought, I could actually just spend the day here. And my wife had to drag me out. But it's got everything. Restaurants on the top, restaurants at the bottom, some amazing restaurants. Yeah. You're in Kyoto when you want to spend your time in a train station.
An 11-story stairs sounds lovely. I think I'd prefer an escalator if I'm there with my luggage, though.
There is an escalator as well for you people who can't handle it, like me.
And if you had to describe Kyoto in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Historic. Definitely. Spectacular. I think that everything you see is a spectacle. It is spectacular. And traditional as well.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Phil, thanks so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love of Kyoto.
My pleasure. Anytime.
And you don't have a travel blog, as I recall.
I do have something called KyotoExperiment.com, where I write about the trials and tribulations of owning a house in Kyoto.
Okay. Good to know. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you very much.
In news of the community, I have a favor to ask. If you could go to Podcast Awards in the next 2 weeks, starting September 15th, 2011, the nominations have opened for podcast awards. And if you wanted to nominate Amateur Traveler and Travel, I wouldn't mind. I heard from Andrew about last week's show on Newfoundland, so glad to finally see some more shows about Canada, especially Newfoundland and Labrador. I've been trying to record some more shows about Canada and actually have one coming up here in the next few shows about Quebec. A reminder that I will be in Boston for 2 different events, the Meet Plan Go event, both the local and the national event, in September and in October. More information on the webpage. And then I will also be speaking at PodCamp Boston. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have a comment, you can leave it on this episode at amateurtraveler.com or drop me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.